Everyone keeps waiting for the press release, the headline that says BlackRock buys XRP, or BlackRock launches on Stellar, or BlackRock partners with XTC. That headline hasn't come. And as of the time of recording, it still hasn't. So the assumption most people have settled into is simple. No announcement means no connection. No connection means nothing to see here. Move along to whatever's pumping this week. That assumption is wrong. And it's wrong in a very specific, very traceable way. BlackRock doesn't need to issue a press release with your favorite ticker in the headline for the infrastructure underneath these three networks to already be connected to the largest asset manager on planet Earth. The connections already exist. They're just built through mechanisms most people never bothered to trace, because tracing them is boring and waiting for a tweet is not. This is worth sitting with before we go any further, because it explains almost everything about how this particular asset manager actually operates. BlackRock manages more money than the entire gross domestic product of most nations on Earth. A firm operating at that scale does not signal its intentions through social media posts or dramatic press conferences. It signals its intentions through where its capital actually flows, months and sometimes years before anyone outside the firm notices the pattern. If you're only watching for an announcement, you are, by definition, watching for the last step in a process that has already been unfolding quietly for a long time before that announcement ever gets written. Let's start with XRP, because this is the one with the most noise around it and the least understanding of what's actually happening underneath that noise. BlackRock has not filed for a spot XRP ETF. Executives have said so directly, publicly, more than once. If you're looking for that filing, it isn't there. And pretending otherwise does nobody any favors. But here's the part that gets buried under all the speculation. BlackRock's flagship tokenized fund, BUIDL, sits at roughly $3 billion in assets. And through a partnership between Ripple and Securitize, holders of BUIDL can swap their shares directly into Ripple's stablecoin, RLUSD, 24 hours a day on-chain. That mechanism went live specifically so BUIDL investors would have a fast, regulated off-ramp into a dollar-backed asset without leaving the blockchain entirely and reintroducing all the friction tokenization was supposed to eliminate in the first place. RLUSD became that path. That's not Ripple inserting itself into BlackRock's business through marketing. That's Ripple's stablecoin solving an actual operational problem for BlackRock's actual flagship product, which is a completely different and far more durable kind of relationship than a partnership announced for headlines. So why hasn't the ETF filing shown up yet? Because BlackRock, unlike almost everyone else in this market, does not chase demand. It waits for demand to prove itself first. Canary Capital's CEO has pointed to an actual number behind that patience. Combined XRP ETF assets across every issuer currently sit around $1 billion. His estimate is that BlackRock needs that figure to roughly triple to somewhere near $3 billion before the commercial case is strong enough to justify building the product. That's not a vague sentiment. That's a quantifiable threshold sitting in plain sight that tells you exactly what has to happen before the headline everyone's waiting for actually gets written. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the same asset manager everyone assumes is completely absent from Stellar's world has, in a roundabout way, already touched it, just not through the door anyone was watching. BlackRock's BUIDL fund is not on Stellar. Let's be precise about that, because plenty of content out there gets this wrong and states it as fact when it isn't. BUIDL lives on Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, Polygon Optimism, Aptos, and BNB Chain. 9 networks, none of them Stellar. What is on Stellar is Franklin Templeton's tokenized government fund, sitting north of $671 million in assets available across 8 different blockchains, including Stellar. Franklin Templeton isn't some minor player trying to keep up. It's one of the other giant decades-old asset managers making the exact same tokenization bet BlackRock is making, just distributing that bet across different set of rails. That is arguably the more interesting story, not the less interesting one, because it means the world's largest tokenization push isn't consolidating around one blockchain and one asset manager. It's spreading deliberately across multiple chains and multiple firms, each hedging which rails end up mattering most once this actually scales. And Stellar has its own separate, massive institutional signal that has nothing to do with BlackRock at all. The organization that clears the overwhelming majority of United States securities transactions selected Stellar as the first public blockchain connected to its tokenization platform, with testing already underway and a fuller rollout targeted for the first half of next year. That is not a token partnership announcement. That is the literal backbone of American security settlement choosing to build a bridge onto the specific network. When people say XLM has no BlackRock story, what they're really saying is XLM has no BlackRock press release, while missing that it has something arguably more structurally significant already underway with the institution that sits underneath nearly every regulated securities trade in the country. Step back and look at what that combination actually represents. You have one of the largest asset managers on earth already running real assets through Stellar's rails. You have the central clearing infrastructure for American securities building a bridge onto that same network. Neither of those facts requires BlackRock's name attached to make them significant. They represent two completely independent institutions operating in different parts of the financial system, arriving at the same network through separate evaluations of what actually works at scale. And that kind of convergence, where unrelated institutions land on the same infrastructure without coordinating with each other, tends to be a far stronger signal than a single company's press release, because it isn't one firm's opinion. It's multiple firms voting with real capital independently and landing in the same place. Now, XDC, which might be the single most overlooked piece of this entire puzzle, because almost nobody has actually traced it. There's a tokenized real-world asset trading right now called USTY, built by a firm called YieldTech and tokenized onto the XDC network through Securitize, the exact same tokenization partner BlackRock itself uses for BUIDL. USTY gives accredited investors access to a BlackRock-managed United States Treasury yield fund. Read that again. A BlackRock-managed fund wrapped and made accessible on-chain, sitting on XDC's network right now, positioning XDC among the top handful of networks globally by market capitalization of tokenized treasury products. To be precise and fair about this, because precision is the entire point of tracing a story like this instead of just repeating a headline, XDC Network itself has publicly stated it has not entered into a direct partnership with BlackRock. This connection runs through YieldTech and Securitize, not a direct handshake between XDC and BlackRock's offices. That distinction matters, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, just to make the story sound bigger than it is. But here's what that distinction actually tells you if you sit with it for a second. BlackRock's own managed products are already finding their way onto XDC's rails through the exact tokenization infrastructure providers BlackRock itself relies on elsewhere. The connection isn't manufactured or exaggerated. It's just indirect, quiet, and running through the same service providers BlackRock already trusts with its own flagship. Fun, there's a broader pattern hiding inside that XDC example, and it applies just as much to the other two networks in this conversation. Modern institutional finance doesn't move through single exclusive partnerships anymore. It moves through shared infrastructure providers, the securitizers, the ARC axes, the custody platforms, who each maintain relationships with multiple asset managers and multiple blockchains simultaneously. That means a single tokenization provider can quietly become the connective tissue linking BlackRock's products to XDC's rails, Franklin Templeton's products to Stellar's Rails, and Ripple's stablecoin to BlackRock's own flagship fund, without any of the underlying institutions ever announcing a direct partnership with each other. The web forms through the middle layer, not the headline layer, and almost nobody is watching the middle layer. This is the actually pattern sitting underneath all three of these networks, and it's the pattern almost nobody is naming out loud. BlackRock isn't choosing one blockchain and issuing a triumphant announcement about it. It's expanding methodically, fund by fund, provider by provider, letting the infrastructure layer do the work quietly while the market keeps waiting for a dramatic headline that was never going to be how this actually plays out. The firm filed for 2 additional tokenized funds this year, proposed on-chain shares for a $7 billion money market fund, and rolled out 2 new tokenized cash management products built specifically to become reserve assets for regulated stablecoin issuers. Every one of those moves adds another thread connecting BlackRock's tokenization machine to the same rails, the same settlement partners, and the same stablecoin infrastructure that XRP, XLM, and XDC are all already plugged into in one form or another. Think about what that actually means mechanically, because this is where the reserve requirement math comes in, and it's worth understanding rather than skimming past. Every time an institution creates a new tokenized fund, that fund needs a settlement RAN, a custody partner, and increasingly a stablecoin off-ramp for investors who want liquidity without leaving the chain. Each of those requirements locks in a small piece of permanent structural demand for whatever network and whatever stablecoin sits underneath that fund. It isn't speculative volume that evaporates the moment sentiment shifts. It's operational plumbing that institutions do not rip out and rebuild every time the market has a bad week. Once a treasury fund is issued on XDC, once a redemption mechanism is built between BUIDL and RLUSD, once Franklin Templeton commits real assets to Stellar's Rails, that infrastructure stays because ripping it out costs real money and real engineering time that institutions have no appetite to spend twice. Multiply that logic across everything BlackRock itself has been doing this year. Separate from any of these 3 networks specifically, each of those moves individually mentions XRP, XLM, or XDC by name, but every single one of them expands the total surface area of BlackRock's tokenization infrastructure. More funds needing settlement rails, more products needing custody partners, more reserve assets needing stablecoin issuers to actually hold them. Each expansion increases the odds that the next thread connects to one of these 3 networks, whether or not that connection ever gets its own dedicated headline. So who actually benefits from everyone waiting on the press release instead of tracing the plumbing? The people already positioned before the headline arrives. That is the entire mechanism behind an arbitrage of attention. The gap between what has already happened and what the broader market has collectively agreed to notice. Every week that goes by, with no dramatic BlackRock announcement about any of these 3 tickers, is a week where the underlying infrastructure keeps deepening in near silence, available to anyone patient enough to actually go look for it. Invisible to everyone, still refreshing a press release page, waiting for permission to pay attention. And here's what should actually stop you for a second and make you recognize the scale of what's being described here. This is not 3 unconnected coins each hoping for a lucky mention. This is the largest asset manager in the history of finance, managing more money than the gross domestic product of most countries on Earth. Building a tokenization strategy that is already structurally touching every one of these 3 networks through funds, settlement, bridges, and shared infrastructure providers without a single dramatic headline required to make it real. The infrastructure doesn't need permission from a press release to already exist. It already exists. It is running right now, settling real transactions, moving real institutional capital. While most of the market treats the absence of a tweet as proof that none of it matters, that is the part that should genuinely sit with you. $10 trillion in assets under management does not move casually, and it does not move in straight, obvious lines that make for easy headlines. It moves through funds, through custody partners, through stablecoin bridges, through tokenization providers shared across a dozen different products. And by the time it becomes obvious enough for a headline, the actual positioning has usually already happened. What's being built right now, quietly across XRP's settlement bridge, Stellar's institutional rails, and XDC's tokenized treasury exposure is not a rumor, and it is not a hope. It is the largest capital allocator on the planet, already threading itself through all three of these networks, piece by piece, whether or not it ever puts out a headline announcing it did. Picture the scale of that for a second, because it's easy to read past a number like 10 trillion without actually letting it land. That is not a hedge fund. That is not a single fund manager with a strong opinion. That is a firm whose asset base is larger than the entire annual economic output of Japan, larger than Germany, larger than almost every economy on the planet except a small handful of the biggest nations that exist. When a firm operating at that scale begins threading tokenized products through the exact settlement rails, redemption bridges, and custody partners tied to these three networks, it is not testing a theory. It is committing operational infrastructure that took real engineering effort to build. And that kind of infrastructure does not get built for assets a firm considers irrelevant. The scale alone should tell you this was never going to arrive as a single dramatic headline. It was always going to arrive exactly like this, quietly, structurally, and already underway long before most of the market noticed. And once you see it laid out this way, you can't really unsee it. Every future headline about BlackRock and any of these three networks will not be the beginning of the story. It will be the moment the rest of the market finally catches up to plumbing that has been running underneath everyone's feet. The entire time, the people who traced it before the headline arrived are not going to be reacting to news. They're going to be watching confirmation of something they already understood. That's the actual difference between speculation and positioning. Speculation waits for permission from a headline. Positioning happens in the space before the headline exists. So this video is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here constitutes financial, legal, or investment advice. Always do your own research and consult qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. If this changed how you're looking at any of these three networks, hit the like button. It's what puts this in front of the people still waiting on a press release that may never come in the form they're expecting. Subscribe if you want the underlying mechanism traced out every time. Instead of waiting for someone else to hand you the headline after the positioning window is already closed, share this with anyone who dismissed one of these three networks because BlackRock hasn't touched it. They need to see exactly how wrong that assumption already is. Drop a comment and tell me which of these three connections surprised you the most. The ROUSD bridge, the Franklin Templeton and DTCC angle on Stellar, or the BlackRock managed fund quietly sitting on XDC. The infrastructure doesn't wait for headlines. Neither should you. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to join my free Telegram community with the link on my channel where I post my daily crypto experience and arbitrage opportunities you can't get anywhere else. This is XRP Hobart signing off.